It started with a knock that wasn't meant to be polite. The HOA president didn't introduce herself the first time she showed up at my door.
She didn't need to.
Everyone in the neighborhood knew who she was, the woman who ran meetings like court hearings and treated bylaws like personal weapons. She stood on my porch holding a folder thick with papers and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're in violation," she said, before I even asked why she was there. According to her, my driveway extension crossed into community aesthetic boundaries. My garden shed was non-compliant in color tone. And the biggest offense? I had installed a small rental unit in my basement years ago, fully permitted by the county, but apparently offensive to her interpretation of single-family integrity. There was just one problem. I wasn't part of the HOA. My house sat on the outer edge of the development, technically surrounded by HOA properties, but never legally absorbed into it. The previous owner had declined membership decades ago, and the paperwork was airtight. I had confirmed that before I ever signed the deed. She either didn't know that or she assumed I didn't. When I calmly explained this, she didn't argue facts. She escalated. "You'll comply," she said, tapping the folder against her palm. "Or we'll begin removal proceedings." Removal proceedings. The confidence in her voice was almost impressive. She spoke like someone who had never once been told no. Over the next few weeks, violation letters began appearing in my mailbox, formal, threatening, stamped with HOA insignia. Fines accumulated on statements addressed to me as a community member. She even had the audacity to send a notice claiming that continued noncompliance could result in legal eviction through HOA authority. That's when I pulled the title report again. Every page confirmed the same thing. My property was independent. No dues. No covenants. No enforceable HOA authority. What she was attempting wasn't enforcement, it was intimidation. I ignored the fines. That's when she tried something bolder. At the next community meeting, she publicly announced that one non-member property was undermining neighborhood standards and hinted at legal remedies to protect property values. The room shifted. Neighbors glanced at me like I was contagious. She didn't say my name, but she didn't have to. Overnight, things changed. Anonymous complaints to the county. Parking enforcement visits. Someone reported my rental unit for inspection twice in 1 month. None of it stuck. Everything passed. But the message was clear. She wasn't going to stop. Then one evening, a certified letter arrived. It stated that the HOA intended to pursue legal action asserting that my property had been functionally integrated into the association due to shared utilities and road access. It was a stretch. A desperate one. But it was also expensive to fight. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. She didn't care whether she had jurisdiction. She cared that I existed outside it. That one house at the edge of the neighborhood that she couldn't regulate. And people like her don't tolerate boundaries they didn't draw. What she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that her own house carried a complication far more significant than my shed color or driveway width. Because while she was busy trying to talk me out of a neighborhood I legally owned into, life was quietly arranging a reversal she never saw coming. The irony didn't start with a lawyer. It started with a hospital call. 3 weeks after the HOA president announced her intention to pursue removal, I got a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. It was a hospital administrator asking if I was related to Margaret Halston. Margaret Halston. I almost didn't place the name at first. I'd always known her as the HOA president. But Margaret Halston was her full name, and technically, yes, I was related to her.
Distantly.
My late grandfather had a younger sister who married into the Halston family decades ago. Over time, branches split, cousins drifted, and contact faded. But legally, there was still a line. A thin one. Quiet. Mostly forgotten. Apparently, not forgotten enough. Margaret had been admitted unexpectedly. Complications. No immediate family nearby. The hospital had gone down the emergency contact list and eventually reached someone who recognized my surname. Within 48 hours, I was sitting in a sterile waiting room across from a social worker explaining that Margaret had no children, no surviving spouse, and no updated will on file. That part made me pause. No updated will. I kept my expression neutral, but internally something shifted. Estate law is simple when paperwork is clean. When it's not, things get complicated fast. And complications don't care about neighborhood politics. Margaret recovered enough to return home a week later, and the HOA drama resumed like nothing had happened. Another violation letter. Another threat of legal escalation. She didn't know about the hospital call. She didn't know the inquiry had already begun. Then, 2 months later, everything changed. It was sudden. A medical emergency at home. No warning. No time to revise documents. And just like that, the woman who had tried to evict me from my own property was gone. The neighborhood reacted with shock, of course. Formal condolences. Temporary board leadership installed. Statements about her dedication to community standards. I kept my distance. Whatever our conflict had been, death erases the tone of it. But the estate process didn't erase paperwork. When probate filings began, my name surfaced almost immediately. Margaret's last valid will, dated nearly 12 years prior, listed her estate beneficiaries in percentages. A cousin who had since passed, a charitable donation that had been dissolved, and a final contingent heir tied to a shared family line.
Me.
Not because we were close, not because of affection, but because estate law follows bloodlines when documents don't evolve. At first, I assumed it would be contested. Surely someone would appear. A closer relative. A forgotten heir. But weeks passed and no one did. The probate court processed the file methodically. Assets were evaluated. Liabilities reviewed. And then the notice arrived. I was the primary surviving legal heir to her estate, including the house. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one she'd threatened to remove me from the neighborhood over, and read the document twice. The house that stood at the center of HOA authority. The house where board meetings had been strategized. The house she had defended as the standard for everyone else. Legally, it was now mine. The irony wasn't loud. It didn't explode. It settled. Because inheritance isn't revenge. It's paperwork. It's signatures. It's timelines. And in this case, it was a twist she never imagined while trying to force me out of a place she didn't control. The board didn't know yet.
But they were about to.
The HOA found out the same way everyone else did, through public record. Probate filings aren't private forever. Once the estate cleared its initial review and the court confirmed beneficiary status, the transfer became visible. It didn't take long for someone on the board to connect the dots between the name on the deed transfer notice and the name they'd been trying to find for months. My phone started ringing that afternoon. First, it was the interim HOA treasurer. Polite. Careful. He said they'd seen something surprising in the filings and wanted to confirm whether it was accurate. I confirmed it.
Calmly.
Silence stretched on the other end. Then came the question they were all thinking. What does this mean for the association? It meant something very simple. I now owned property inside the HOA boundaries. Not adjacent. Not surrounded. Not exempt. Inside. Margaret's house wasn't like mine. It was fully subject to HOA bylaws, dues, and voting rights. And under those bylaws, ownership automatically transferred membership privileges, including a board vote. The interim president requested a meeting to discuss continuity. That phrase almost made me laugh. Continuity implied stability. What they were facing was the opposite. I agreed to attend the next board session. When I walked into Margaret's former living room, now temporarily being used for HOA discussions, the atmosphere was tight. The same people who had once watched her threaten me now avoided eye contact. No one mentioned the violation letters. No one mentioned removal proceedings. They didn't have to. The interim president cleared his throat and formally acknowledged the transfer of ownership. He expressed condolences. He spoke about community unity. Then he pivoted, gently, to expectations. As a new member of the HOA, he said, "We hope you'll uphold the standards Margaret worked hard to enforce." There it was. Not an apology. A test. I responded carefully. I told them I intended to comply with bylaws applicable to this property. I also clarified something important. My original home remained outside the HOA's jurisdiction, and any previous enforcement attempts against it had been baseless. A few faces tightened at that. Then I did something they didn't expect. I asked for copies of all board communications related to my prior violations. Meeting minutes, email threads, legal consultations. Everything. The room shifted instantly. One board member attempted to deflect, suggesting those matters were historical. I reminded them that as a current HOA member and property owner, I was entitled to review board records, especially those involving actions taken against a property owner who is never subject to their authority. That was the moment they realized the balance had changed. Margaret had operated through intimidation and assumption. I operated through documentation. Within days, the records began arriving, and they were revealing. Internal emails showed clear acknowledgement that my home wasn't technically within HOA control, but Margaret had insisted on pursuing enforcement anyway, arguing that if they let one non-member defy aesthetic standards, it would weaken perceived authority. Perceived authority. That phrase stood out. They hadn't tried to remove me because they believed they legally could. They tried because they thought no one would challenge them. I didn't threaten lawsuits. I didn't raise my voice. I simply attended the next board meeting with highlighted copies of their own emails and asked one question. Would you like these addressed internally or through counsel? No one answered immediately. Because once you expose power built on perception instead of legality, it doesn't hold the same weight. And now, sitting at that table, not as the outsider they tried to expel, but as a voting property owner inside their structure, I had options they hadn't planned for. The real question wasn't whether I'd use them. It was how. The board didn't sleep well after that meeting. I know because the emails started coming at 6:12 a.m. The interim president wanted to reset the relationship. The treasurer suggested forming a compliance subcommittee. Another member proposed mediation to move forward constructively. Funny how fast cooperation appears once leverage changes hands. I didn't respond emotionally. I responded strategically. First, I paid the HOA dues on Margaret's former house in full and on time. No excuses. No delays. I made it clear I was operating in complete compliance inside their structure. Then I did something they didn't expect. I submitted a formal request to be placed on the ballot for the next board vacancy. You could practically hear the oxygen leave the room. Under the bylaws, any member in good standing could run. There was no exclusion clause. No cooling-off period. No morality test. And since Margaret's passing had created instability, a seat was already opening due to a resignation. They couldn't block me without violating their own rules. And this time, I had copies of every rule. The campaign period was short, just 3 weeks before the neighborhood vote. I didn't knock on doors angrily. I didn't air dirty laundry publicly. I simply introduced myself to homeowners as someone who believed in clarity, fairness, and documented authority. You'd be surprised how many residents quietly admitted they'd felt pressured under Margaret's leadership. Fines for minor landscaping. Threat letters over harmless decorations. Selective enforcement, depending on who you were friends with. Fear keeps communities quiet. But once fear leaves, people talk. I made one promise during those conversations. No enforcement without jurisdiction. No fines without documentation. No rules applied unevenly. Nothing radical. Just lawful governance. Election night was tense. Ballots were counted in the same living room where Margaret once tried to remove me. When the final tally came in, I won the seat by a clear margin. Not by revenge votes. By relief votes. The first board meeting with me officially seated felt different. No one spoke over anyone. The tone was cautious, measured. And when agenda items involving enforcement came up, I asked questions no one had asked before. Where is the authority clause? Is this homeowner actually within boundary lines? Has this rule been applied consistently? Paper trails suddenly mattered. Selective enforcement stopped almost overnight. Not because I threatened anyone, but because now someone at the table was reading the fine print. But Section 4 wasn't about control. It was about correction. I introduced a motion to formally close all prior enforcement actions against properties outside HOA boundaries, including mine. The board hesitated, not because they disagreed, because admitting it would mean acknowledging they had overstepped. I kept it simple. This protects the association legally, I said. Continuing enforcement outside jurisdiction exposes us. Liability is a language boards understand. The motion passed. Violation letters were formally rescinded. Files closed. Records corrected. For the first time since moving into that house, I had written confirmation that the HOA had no authority over my original property. But I didn't stop there. I proposed a boundary audit, an independent survey to clearly mark HOA jurisdiction so no future homeowner would face what I did. That motion passed too. Because once governance shifts from intimidation to documentation, even former enforcers prefer protection. By the end of that quarter, the HOA wasn't dismantled. It was stabilized. And here's the irony. Margaret had tried to remove me from the neighborhood entirely. Instead, I ended up shaping how it operated. Not through hostility, through structure. But Section 4 taught me something important. Power isn't about forcing outcomes. It's about understanding systems well enough that when someone tries to misuse them, you can calmly correct the course. And the board knew something else now. If anyone ever tried to weaponize bylaws again, they wouldn't just face resistance. They'd face someone sitting at the table, pen in hand, ready to document every word. By the time the next annual HOA meeting rolled around, the neighborhood felt different. Quieter. Not silent in a fearful way, but steady. Predictable. Measured. For the first time in years, there were no emergency motions, no surprise violation letters, no whispered complaints about selective enforcement. The tone had shifted from authority to accountability. And that shift wasn't loud. It was procedural. Margaret's house remained rented, just as she had arranged before she passed. I never moved into it. I never used it as leverage. It simply became an investment property, one that happened to give me a seat at a table that once tried to exclude me. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. At the annual meeting, financial reports were presented transparently. Enforcement logs were reviewed publicly. The new boundary survey was displayed on a projector so every homeowner could see exactly where HOA jurisdiction began and ended. Clarity removes fear. One homeowner raised her hand during open forum. "I just want to say," she said carefully, "this is the first time I've felt like the board works for the neighborhood instead of against it." No applause. Just nods. That mattered more. After the meeting, several residents approached me privately. Not to praise, not to gossip, but to ask questions about how bylaws actually work, how elections function, how enforcement authority is legally structured. That told me something important. Communities don't collapse because of rules. They collapse because people stop understanding them. Margaret hadn't been evil. She'd been unchecked. Over time, authority without accountability hardens into assumption. And assumption turns into entitlement. When she tried to remove me from the neighborhood, she believed she had the power. She never stopped to verify whether she had the jurisdiction. That distinction changed everything. Months later, during a routine board review, we formally amended the enforcement policy to require third-party verification before issuing major penalties. Not because we expected abuse, but because systems should prevent it. Protection shouldn't depend on personality. It should depend on structure. Eventually, my term on the board ended. I chose not to run again. Stability had been restored. The processes were cleaner. The culture had shifted. And I never wanted power for its own sake. I just wanted fairness. Before stepping down, I left one recommendation in writing. Authority must always be documented. If it cannot be cited, it cannot be enforced. Simple.
Clear.
Repeatable. Today, when I walk through the neighborhood, no one avoids eye contact. No one watches from behind curtains. The atmosphere is intense. It's ordinary. And ordinary is underrated. The strangest part? If Margaret had never tried to kick me out, none of this would have happened. I would have remained a homeowner outside the HOA, quietly minding my business. She would have remained president, operating on assumption instead of verification. But conflict forces clarity. Her attempt to remove me didn't end with eviction. It ended with reform. Not because I inherited her house, but because I inherited responsibility and chose to use it differently. That's the real twist people miss. Inheritance didn't give me power. Understanding did. And once you understand a system, once you read every clause, trace every boundary, and document every motion, no one can use it against you without exposing themselves. The neighborhood still has rules. It still has a board. It still enforces standards. But now it does so within its limits. And limits are what keep authority honest. Margaret once believed she could push me out. Instead, her actions pulled me in. Not as an enemy, not as a conqueror, but as proof that systems only remain fair when someone is willing to read the fine print. And sometimes, the person they try hardest to remove becomes the one who ensures everyone else stays protected.